Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Connor Tomlinson of Courage.Media. We started off by speaking about Connor's investigations into social media advertising used by smuggling gangs, which features images of drunk and partially undressed British women, feeding into this wider issue of why mass immigration, particularly from some parts of the world with particularly misogynistic cultures, is so disastrous for British women, European women, and yet is a very difficult thing to talk about. It's very rarely spoken about in feminist circles. We spoke about the efforts by British government to control public opinion and Connor's research into the Right Q unit of the Home Office. And we spoke about middle-class snobbery as a crucial factor in understanding why elite attitudes towards grooming gangs and all the other things that we discussed in today's episode have become so entrenched. The extended version of the episode, as always, is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the bonus episodes I do with my husband, the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, the live stream AMAs that I've started doing. So I did one with Rob Henderson in January. I've got a couple more scheduled with Helen Roy and Alex Kashuta. Anyone paid subscriber or no can watch the live streams and ask questions, and then later on the recording is made available to all the paid subs. And you can also find the MMM chat community, which is very lively. Connor, I wanted to start by talking about a story that you broke I think 2 years ago now, 18 months ago, about I'll let you explain it, but basically you looked at the social media propaganda, should we call it, advertising used by smuggling gangs, advertising services to get people into Britain illegally, and you noticed something disturbing. I'm rolling out the runway for you. What did you discover in this research?
So, this was shortly after there was a large controversy about Albanian people smuggling and drug trafficking gangs using TikTok and video platforms to advertise their services to young men to transport them across Europe and over the English Channel into Britain. And there were videos, it was a bit like a travel agency for illegal migrants, videos of young men throwing around wads of cash as they were intercut with footage of them breaking into border fences and in small boats and crossing the channel. And after that was broken, I think it was on Nigel Farage's show on GB News at the time, I got a tip from someone who was working for the Home Office as a contractor in data analytics. And he had been monitoring a trend of North African Instagram accounts and that were posting TikTok videos from TikTok accounts to advertise people trafficking services on Instagram with particularly Algerian and Moroccan flags and Arabic writing in the bios and over the videos to North African men, but using videos not only of people trafficking, but also of drunk women on nights out in Britain. We later found that these were taken videos from places like Manchester. In states of undress, falling over, filmed without their consent, alongside, intercut with, the videos of the men crossing the channel. And you would get also very disturbing videos like North African and Sub-Saharan African men running up to European women in the street and dragging them off as if they'd wanted this, or videos and images of interracial couples interspersed with footage of people trafficking. And you'd also get videos like churches burning in France. So there was this sort of celebratory aura of conquest and violence and adventuring for these North African men, but also the idea that the women of Europe are the willing spoils of said conquest. And we know this was involved filming women without their consent, because only this year a man in Bradford was convicted of filming women on a night out without their knowledge in Manchester. Now, we don't have that man's name, but from the Sky News reporting of his arrest and charge, even in a blurred photo, you can see that he is not your typical Englishman. Let's put it that way. So there is a very real salience that men from other parts of the world, particularly Islamic countries, view women as property and the kind of right of conquest. And when I published this news first and passed it on to GB News after I reported on it on my podcast, GB News ran the story, and it was stated that the Home Office had knowledge of this and were monitoring it for a while, but took no action. And we know that Instagram eventually gained knowledge of this, and I think they took down the accounts. But Instagram, Meta more broadly until recently, and Twitter for a while until Elon Musk acquired it, had this sort of material on their website. They had certain hashtags that they knew were being used by paedophiles to trade child sexual exploitation material. And Instagram not only knew about this, but the Wall Street Journal found, around the same time that I broke this story in 2023, that Instagram would put up warnings saying, this will lead you, if you click this link or look at this post, this will lead you onto websites that might host child sexual exploitation material. Would you like to continue? And so rather than taking down the account, they just put up a warning, knowing that this illegal exploitative content was out there, and still allowed users to access it anyway. So I think there's a real failure on both the part of the Home Office and on the part of social media companies to police this stuff.
It's interesting that they're doing this in plain sight. It's interesting that, this is so often the case, I find, that actually it doesn't take that much digging on the internet to find people saying the quiet part out loud, right? Particularly when it comes to attitudes towards European women. I spoke about this with Poppy Coburn on the podcast recently. I find it really, really disturbing the extent to which racial resentment is channeled towards sexual violence against white women, either real or imagined. I see this so often. I think this is such a big theme in pornography. Like, I've written before, and I intend to write more about it. I'm trying to think of how to formulate it properly, that I'm sure that part of what is affecting the attitudes of men, particularly in the Islamic countries, towards white women, is their consumption of pornography, that they will consume so much like degrading material on mainstream platforms featuring white women before they've ever actually met a white woman. I found it very instructive when I travelled in places like India and Morocco. And it doesn't matter how modestly you dress. This is what the guidebooks always say, that you should just dress modestly and then you'll be fine. No, you can wear a hijab and you will still have the most disgusting things shouted at you in the street. You'll be followed. You'll be, it's incredible, right? And I feel like most British people are too awkward to talk about this. But it is so evident if you just ask these men, what do you think about white women? They'll just tell you.
My friend Alex Phillips has just released a documentary on how women's safety has been compromised by immigration. She's had this long-standing theory as well, that as a conventionally attractive blonde white woman, she has been harassed by men from the Indian subcontinent, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, who have been taught to see white women as willing and game for sexual harassment because of their porn consumption. And we know this as well from testimonies from victims of the predominantly Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, that they were called white whores, white slags, all sorts of other profanity, which I won't repeat here, and that the families of the rape gang perpetrators, when they've spoken rather candidly in interviews with other Muslim women, have said, well, those girls deserved it because look at the way they dress, Allah cast shame upon them. There was a very revealing moment in a Rochdale rape gang trial where the ringleader, and whether or not he was attempting to plea insanity by doing a bit of a Blackadder by pulling his underpants over his head and shouting "wibble," or whether this was just what he really thought is up for debate. But he was saying, all you white people are inferior, we Pakistanis are the supreme race, and therefore your girls deserve to be abused because they are racially inferior and they are kafir, they're unbelievers, they don't abide by Islamic modesty standards. So there is this strong strain of ethnic and religious resentment that they're very open and honest about. And as for the particularly more North African, Moroccan, Algerian asylum seekers, illegal migrants who are advertising women as the spoils of war, we know that they think this because there was a case in Hartlepool in 2023 where a Moroccan asylum seeker, he had a very interesting name. It was Ahmed Ali Alid. He stabbed a pensioner called Terence Carney to death, but right before that he'd attacked one of his asylum seeker bunkmate who was a Christian convert, and during which he'd shouted, Allahu Akbar, this is for Gaza. And when the police questioned him, because he has very low impulse control, he decided to say that if I had an AK-47, I would have shot thousands more because of what's been done to children in Gaza. I would have taken your children from you. So because particularly in Northwest Europe, particularly because we're living in the hangover of Christianity, or some of us still are Christians, we think that morality resides in the individual. We think that each person is responsible for their own actions. We don't attribute guilt by race or religion or civilization, but that's just not the case for a lot of other places in the world. They have a lot of historical baggage. They have a very strong sense of ethnic in-group identity, and they won't speak up about injustices perpetrated by friends and family members in case it disadvantages or brings shame on the religion, the family, or the clan more broadly. And so we're not dealing on the same moral terms here. And so a permissive immigration system actually imports a completely incompatible morality that sees women, particularly the women of the opposing race or religion, as available to be abused by the men of the imported religion without any moral consequences. And it's not just me saying this. Dr. Taj Hargey, who's the cleric at the Oxford Islamic Centre, has, in 2013, he wrote a column about this, but he recently gave an interview to Martin Daubney of GB News. He said, look, these men are taught in their mosques and madrasas, whether over in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa or now in the UK, because lots of the mosques and madrasas receive a lot of funding from Islamist extremist groups. They're taught to see these women as inferior, and they're taught that because they are unbelievers, if you sexually assault them, this doesn't penalise you in getting into heaven. So it's essentially fair game. So we do need to recognise this and adjust our, let's say, integration strategy and also our immigration policy accordingly to not put these women at risk.
I've been criticised before for talking about this in the sense that I am, on the record as being quite sceptical of the sexual revolution, and I don't want this to. That's actually not the drum that I'm banging here. I mean, I do think that I don't think it's a great idea, right, for women to be drunken in a state of undress in public, right? I don't think that's a great idea. I don't think that pornography is good, yada yada. Everyone listening knows my views on this. However, that is not that is not the primary problem here by any means. I think it aggravates the problem. I think the fact that our sexual culture is so different, even from the sexual culture of, say, the 1950s in this country, I think definitely makes that culture clash more acute. However, I think it's almost certainly the case that it wouldn't matter, actually, how British women, European women behaved. The fundamental gap here is actually to do with viewing the women of foreign men as legitimate targets for sexual abuse if they are, unprotected, if they're available, right? I think what the sexual revolution has done, which has made this worse, is that women in Britain are pretty much unprotected. We go out on our own. We are not chaperoned in crucial settings. We have become used to doing all sorts of things we should absolutely be able to do, like take taxis on our own, or meet with men that we don't know, or show our hair, wear bikinis on the beach. One of the problems that's besetting Australian beaches, I have read, I haven't been to Australia before, we're going to Australia in March, I'll find out maybe whether this is true, at least some city beaches, is that the culture in Australia is that it's completely fine to wear bikinis on the beach, right? And that, yes, sometimes you might. The thing is, I can't even remember the last. Maybe I'm too old, but I can't remember the last time I was actually wolf whistled or catcalled by a white man. Like years and years and years, right? So you can wear a bikini on the beach, and the culture that you'll just, everyone will avert their eyes pretty much, and it will all sort of be fine. I am reading now that that's no longer the case because there've been such a big influx of men actually from India, so not from Islamic countries, but countries where, one, white women are super, super sexualized, and two, it isn't normal for women to walk around in bikinis all the time. And men from these countries are just not, they do not behave in the way that women are expecting. And the consequence of all this is such an important feminist issue, because the consequence of all this is that women are having their freedoms radically restricted because women don't feel safe doing certain things, right? And even though I don't, as an on-the-record critic of the sexual revolution, I think that this is dreadful. I think this is so dreadful, and I completely agree with Alex on this issue, and I think she's been really brave in talking about it and talking about her own experiences, because how is it that feminists are not universally up in arms about this? I mean, I know the answer, but I'm lamenting it.
It would be difficult enough having this conversation within a civilization about sexual norms. And you know that I'm in complete agreement with you on all of this. I think that especially your chapter in the case against sexual revolution really hammered home just how much the porn industry profits off of industrial scale child abuse.
Yes.
So it should be shut down for that
Yeah.
reason alone. You know, they bake it into their business model. So, but that's a difficult enough conversation to have in a homogenous population that has been through the sexual revolution. To then add that clash of civilizations to the mix with a civilization that has a view of women that is hundreds of years older. Even then, it's worse than the medieval Christian view of women around that time. That isn't interested in having a dialogue at all. They're just interested in a lot of cases of these men doing what they can get away with, and they think they can get away with quite a lot. That conversation is impossible. And we know from the fact that in 2023, according to the Global Organised Crime Index, the UK is number one in Western Europe and second in all of Europe for crimes committed by foreign nationals. We know from some painstaking data stitched together by the likes of the Telegraph and the Centre for Migration Control that foreign nationals are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for sex offences than British nationals. If you break that down by particular national origin, I mean, we don't have that data in the UK because, weirdly, our Home Office, our Ministry of Justice, etc., either doesn't collect it or refuses to publish it when the likes of Patrick Christis or Rupert Lowe ask. But if you look at Danish data, we know that the likes of Afghanistan, Iraq, Qatar are 3 to 8 times more likely to commit sex offences than native Danes. They're 2.5 times more likely to end up in prison. So they commit these attacks against women at far higher rates than the men of European civilizations that have been through the sexual revolution. You know, you'd be hard pressed to say that the Netherlands and Denmark haven't been very progressively sexually revolutionized, and yet it's still imported men committing the majority of these attacks. And for some of your female listeners who are thinking, well, you know, why is Connor particularly bothered about this? Of course, you have a skin in the game, as does Alex, as it were. Well, for me, it's not like I don't have a fiance, friends, and family members who are put directly at risk of this. But I remember my secondary school and university girlfriend, despite my received pronunciation, I actually am from a working class family, live in a working class area, and she used to get bibbed by white van men as she was walking down the road on the way to the gym. And that was always uncomfortable, and she'd be on the phone talking to me about it, and she'd say that she was annoyed by this. And yeah, that's grotesque behavior, and again, wolf whistling is crude and grotesque. But there's not the same undercurrent of violence as there is with the imported, very backwards views that lots of these men from North and Sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian subcontinent have. And I think that the reluctance of some feminists to acknowledge this is the same anthropology that fed into the sexual revolution, which is men and women are fundamentally blank slates, all sex differences are cosmetic, all of morality is consent-based because we're self-authoring liberal individuals, also feeds into this commentary on civilizations. It's as if they're only backward in their views of women because they're over there somewhere. So if we bring them through the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, this kind of ineluctable spell of liberal, secular, enlightened British values will fall upon them. And if we just wait long enough, they won't have these predatory attitudes towards women anymore. And it's a fundamentally optimistic but very misguided view of human nature. Because as I said at the start, these people are not interested in that conversation. They're not interested in converting to a different set of values. They've come here for very different premises. They've not come here to, make money or integrate. They've come here because, as they're advertising, they see women as the spoils of war who are game for it. And so we need to recognize that. Lots of feminists need to catch up with your position, essentially, Louise, if we're going to understand that immigration is becoming a women's safety issue.
My impression among women I know is that because this isn't really publicly spoken about, I mean, you mentioned the crime statistics from Denmark. I think there are some other European countries that have this, but the point is, not only does the British government not really collect this data, or certainly doesn't release it in the way that we might hope that they would, it's also definitely not advertised. This is not widely acknowledged. And I think actually most vaguely progressive people would assume that the stereotypes are false, and they would certainly try and like suppress any problematic thoughts in their own minds. But I do notice among the women I know that lived experience, let's say, it can be very, very instructive. Like a very dear friend of mine who is generally very progressive and is always telling me off for my terrible views on various ways. She lived in Whitechapel when she was an undergraduate, and she's never got over it because Whitechapel, for people who don't know, is a very, very Muslim area. I think, but primarily Bengali, and she had to give up running. She likes to go running, and she would go running. But if she went running around there, she would get such aggressive sexual harassment, like terrifying, that she just stopped. She was just too scared to do that. And even now, a decade on, she's not forgotten that. And I think that my impression among the women that I speak to about this is that those who have lived in those kind of areas, or who have traveled to countries that are particularly like horrible in this sense, are the ones who are most likely to have realised that there is an issue here. I do find it incredible that Jess Phillips famously said after the Cologne New Year mass sexual assaults, which were at least 5 years ago now, quite a long time. Oh, but that's just what happens in Birmingham on every Friday night or something like that. Like this incredible level of denialism. I mean, I am sure that Jess Phillips has actually seen enough of the world and seen enough of Britain to know that that's not true deep down. But it is still the case that actually Britain is so segregated that it is still possible not to realise this. My impression from hearing Alex, I'm going to get her on the podcast soon. My impression from hearing Alex talking about her experiences is that a big part of why she kind of woke up to this problem is because she hasn't said where, but she lives in an area where she gets this particularly aggressive style of sexual harassment all the time because of the local demographics. So like basically what seems to be happening at the moment is there's an omerta, mostly in like polite discourse, but you have individuals having horrible experiences and reaching their own conclusions privately. That seems to be happening at a large scale.
Same things happen with my fiance. I won't say where she lives, but she used to run around the park, and there's been a large influx of the types of migrants that have been coming since 2021 that we've been talking about here. And she got approached one day and he wouldn't stop running next to her. So now she's running around very residential areas, very well lit streets, and she's had to change her route completely, and it really spooked her. So, this is a common experience. But I think you're correct in that lots of women don't feel comfortable talking about this because it's impolite, and for the time being, in England at least, comes with a lot of reputational risk.
Yeah.
And it's because this deny your own eyes hyper reality is being layered atop this lived experience. I think lived experience here is very legitimate epistemology when we're being gaslit by the media and the government, who are not only withholding statistics but contorting statistics and putting out false ones to give you an erroneous impression. The worst example of this, of course, is to do with the rape gang scandal. In 2020, the Home Office issued what Charlie Peters has called a complete whitewash paper, where in their own samples they cited papers where 75% of the perpetrators were quote-unquote Asian. And I think even then that's hiding the ball, because it's not all Asians doing this. It's not Sikhs, it's not Japanese businessmen, it's particularly Pakistani Muslims. And yet they still went on to say the vast majority of perpetrators of child sexual exploitation are white. Now, you would expect that in a majority white British country for the time being, but per capita it found that Pakistani men, Asian, but Pakistani men, are more than 3 times more likely than the white British population to commit such crimes. And then even then it didn't break it down to particular type of religious and racial predation that we've been talking about. But the headline was then grabbed by the likes of Nick Lowell's of Hope Not Hate or Dr. Ella Cockbain to say this rampant racism and Islamophobia has been debunked because white men are actually more responsible for these crimes, and so you're more likely to be attacked by white men. And so what that does is that suppresses the innate instinct that lots of women will have for self-preservation to go, oh, I might cross the street if that suspicious-looking man is coming towards me because I don't want to be seen as racist. And so that will disarm them. And members of the government are just as responsible for this. You've spoken about Jess Phillips, who I mean, last year decided to make a week-long media storm about me chatting to Liz Truss on a podcast, but wasn't bothered enough about the childhood sexual abuse in Oldham to commission a national inquiry. Well, my friend Stephen Edgington, who's done lots of very good reporting on the Home Office for GB News over the years, found that when civil servants had asked Jess Phillips for the stats for sex crimes by national origin, because she's, of course, the Minister for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls, she and the head civil servant, sort of diversity officer in chief at the Home Office, Matthew Rycroft, were stum. They just wouldn't respond to their own civil servants asking for the data that presumably they held. And we know they probably hold this because when Patrick Christis asked, okay, can we have this data? They said it would be too expensive to compile. And then he offered to pay them to compile the data. They still said no. So they just don't want it to get out. And instead it's being drip fed through FRI requests or Telegraph efforts or Neil O'Brien MP's very good Substack to put this together to give us a vague picture. And that vague picture is particularly damning for the types of men that we're importing at record numbers ever since 2021.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Sexual crime data is a very vexed area of data collection, right? It always has been because there's massive underreporting. There's like more, well, there may not be more underreporting for this than any other crime, but it's up there in terms of the level of underreporting. So it's already a difficult area. Add to this one of the classic strategies that is used by people who are trying to obfuscate specifically the grooming gangs data is to lump all types of sexual crime together. So to lump together, and I saw this actually, I wrote about this for The Spectator recently. When I was working at a rape crisis centre, it was really common to hear, to witness people basically doing this in real time. So to do this as well, I mean, because this is coming from, liberal feminists who are super blank slatist about sex differences, they'd say, oh, people of all genders sexually assault people of all genders, men can be victims of women too, la la la. And it's like, yes, I know, but come on, come on. We're talking about 99% plus of perpetrators being men and 95% ish of victims being women. Yes, you can throat clear as much as you like, but realistically that's what we're talking about. And they'll do the same thing when it comes to obfuscating the data on ethnicity. So for instance, if you include teenagers sharing explicit images with one another, right, which is widespread, and there are certainly examples of, it's a horrendous thing, and it's one of the products of porn culture and of ubiquitous smartphones that now revenge porn being shared around schools is something that girls suddenly have to be terrified of. They didn't have to be terrified of that in my day. You have that lumped in with non-contact sexual abuse, i.e. sharing images, like paedophiles sharing images with each other. That's a crime that, as far as I can tell, is probably disproportionately committed by white men. That's certainly what the data suggests, that there's a slight disproportionality there. You have that lumped in with the rape and torture of 12-year-old girls by these rape gangs, right? And if you do that, you can do a pretty good job of obfuscating exactly what's going on in terms of who exactly is committing these crimes. And obviously we have to say, all of this is horrible, but come on, there is clearly a spectrum. There is clearly a spectrum. And what the sort of abuse that the so-called grooming gangs are committing is recognised in law as being highly, highly aggravated. There are so many factors that come with it, which are which make it worse, which make it more distressing. I mean, this goes all the way up to murder. I feel like I'm going mad sometimes when when I look at these efforts to use gaslighting. I don't like overusing the word gaslighting because it's now basically come to mean lying. But I feel like the effect is to make people disbelieve their own eyes.
Yeah, the reason for the obfuscation, I think, is because if you point out the religious and racially aggravated nature of these crimes, you note that this is an imported problem, unlike the disproportionate sharing of child sexual exploitation material by white men, if we want to say white British men, so it's a homegrown issue.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, on record, as I've said multiple times, that is under prosecuted, under penalized, because lots of them just get no jail time and a
Hugh
short
Edwards.
sex offence registry like sentence, and they get essentially under house arrest for like a year. I mean, Hugh Edwards is a very famous example of this. Sentencing needs to be much harder, but just because that exists doesn't mean we therefore need to import more sex criminals.
Yeah.
Like, all of those sex criminals being in the country is down to government choice.
Yeah.
There's a difference between a British citizen committing this crime and men coming from places where we know before they arrive here their values and their ideals and their perception of British women and Christian women are more likely to make them attack those women. There's a very big difference between bringing those men over in their droves and having a homegrown issue that we should crack down on a lot harder. But recognizing that then indicts civil servants, it indicts academics, it indicts politicians who have been complicit in peddling this multicultural ideal that we can, if we just apologize for the sins of our past enough, appease all of these cultures brought into the melting pot, and somehow one won't be a particularly virulent and illiberal strain. It indicts them as their project not working and them inflicting avoidable harms on the women and girls of this country. And you say gaslighting, so I've been doing some reporting for quite some time on what I would describe as the Home Office's propaganda unit, which at time of recording, knowledge of this has reached a fever pitch because some leaks from an internal report commissioned by Home Secretary Yvette Cooper in the wake of the Southport murders and then subsequent protests and riots in the summer of 2024. Some of these sentences were leaked in November 2024, but they've now been handed, the full report has been handed to Policy Exchange, and this has been reported on GB News and the like. This report said that, for example, the grooming gangs, the rape gangs, are a, quote, grievance narrative that has been invented by right-wing extremists, and the tales of two-tier policing, which we know did happen to do with the rape gangs because the police themselves said we were too afraid of stirring up community tensions, disrupting community cohesion, and being called racist to actually police these rape gangs that we knew were going on. How much of that is a cover, by the way, for police being in leagues with the Pakistani drug gangs themselves is up for dispute, but still, we know those are clear examples of two-tier policing, but the Home Office themselves said claiming two-tier policing is itself a right-wing extremist narrative. Now, Black Lives Matter have been claiming two-tier policing in terms of racial injustice for many years, but as soon as it's turned round and we start talking about abuse of white girls and women by imported third world, very misogynistic men, suddenly it's a racist and Islamophobic problem. And this is a gaslighting technique because what RICU does, and this is the authors of the report, RICU are the Research, Information and Communications Unit in the Home Office. It's the parent body of anti-extremism group Prevent, the same group that have let, unfortunately, terrorists like Axel Rudo Cabana or David Amos's murder, Abi Harbi Ali, slip through the net undetected, and they went on to kill MPs and the girls at Southport. This body, they control, in the aftermath of terror attacks, newspaper front page coverage. They bus imams out to the site of the terror attacks in what they call controlled spontaneity exercises to hold up placards and banners and preach messages of unity. This happened in the aftermath of the 2017 Westminster Bridge and London Bridge attacks. It happened seemingly in the aftermath of the Nottingham stabbing by Valdo Calacane, which nobody knew at the time was an attack by a schizophrenic man. It was suspected it was an Islamist attack, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, a One Nottingham Together rally materialised. The parents were told to give out messages saying, don't hold any hate in your heart for anyone of one ethnicity or one religion. It seemed very coerced, and behind them were various community and religious leaders lined up to show a message of unity. This seems to have happened in the aftermath of the Southport protests and riots on August the 8th. There was this image of Socialist Worker Party and Stand Up to Racism counter-protesters when a rumour, which is now admitted to be a hoax by Nick Laws of Hope Not Hate, spread of 100 far-right rallies in left-wing places like Walthamstow. It's very strange.
Yeah.
When they didn't materialise, but all the Socialist Worker Party people with their pre-printed placards were stood out there was a photograph taken, and different newspapers of different ideological persuasions all ran the same story on the front page saying, united against the far right. I put an FOI request in about that, by the way, and they said Raikou had no input into writing the headlines. So they carefully sidestepped the question about whether or not they dictated the newspaper coverage and the topics and the images, but there you go.
The images were all the same, you noticed?
Yes. Yeah. Very curious. And the most prominent example of this is in 2014 when British aid worker Alan Henning was beheaded by ISIS. There was an image of a Union Jack hijab printed on the front page of the Sun newspaper. Now, we know this was Raikou's doing because internal emails that were printed, and Laura Dodsworth covered this very well in her book A State of Fear, internal emails showed that Raikou called it our product. And what they also called their product was the campaign that produced this image, which was hashtag Making a Stand by the charity Inspire. Now, Inspire was the charity run by Dame Sarah Khan. She was the government's former independent, and I stress independent here because I don't think she was, anti-extremism advisor. It just so happens that her sister, Sabrina Khan, was the deputy head of Raikou at the time, working under the head of Raikou, who was Richard Chalk, who himself was the chief of staff to Baroness Saida Vorsi, who obviously is now famous for sitting on the all-party parliamentary group for British Muslims, who has invented this Islamophobia definition. So there is a clear effort here by the Home Office, who has many Muslim activists in it, by the way. There's a 700 Islamic network in the Home Office that works to recruit more Muslims and advance Muslim interests, so ensure that Islam doesn't look bad in light of the actions by some Muslims, as we've been discussing, that have been imported over here and committed sex attacks or terror attacks on young girls. There is a concerted effort by the Home Office and its various activists to ensure that public outrage about immigration, multiculturalism, and the Islamic perception of white British girls is not looked upon unfavourably when the inevitable happens. So gaslighting is not an unfair way to characterise it.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is that actually up until recently, it's worked really remarkably well. The thing that's been remarked upon by a lot of Americans in particular since grooming gangs have been back in the news has been like, why aren't British people more angry about this? Why hasn't there been like serious revolt, right? Why are people apparently letting this happen? And part of the answer is that actually the government, until recently, has done a good job of managing. Like, propaganda works. That's why states do it, because it works. And things like the Don't Look Back in Anger in Manchester, I mean, I remember that. It worked. It was very effective at diffusing anger. But I think it works only temporarily. And I suspect we've reached the end of the road because now distrust of government is so widespread. Even among people who are otherwise fairly friendly towards the establishment, it's not just radicals and conspiracy theorists who think that the government actually isn't telling them the truth. And this was the key problem with Southport, right? That right from the get-go, when the police said this isn't a terrorist incident, almost no one believed them. Maybe they would have done 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but they didn't this time.
It's important to raise Don't Look Back in Anger as well, because disaster planner Lucy Easthope, who worked for Raikou, wrote for The Guardian, saying that she thought the messages of resistance, including Don't Look Back in Anger, put out after the Manchester Arena bombing were a mistake, which means that the government centrally planned the Don't Look Back in Anger messages while the bodies of those young girls bombed at the Ariana Grande concert were still being identified. That is depraved in the extreme. And this is what our money's been spent on. This is what we've been told for years. It's resurfaced particularly recently Because the story that we started off with this marketing of vulnerable British girls on nights out to North African people traffickers, this has regained prominence because Sarah Khan in December of last year put out a paper where she identified all these new conspiracy theories. She used Hope Not Hate to do the polling. While she was working in government, by the way, Hope Not Hate got hundreds of thousands of pounds in taxpayer grants by the Home Office and the Paul Hamlin Foundation, which is a Home Office-funded pro-migration charity, to establish local chapters around the country, like rapid response units, to mobilize pro-refugee protests anytime that a counter-migration protest kicked off. So if you're wondering how all of those sudden anti-far-right rallies sprung up after Southport, well, you have your answer. There's the photo op. But in her report with Hope Not Hate, Sarah Khan wrote the following passage. Alongside the promotion of Great Replacement theory, contemporary far-right narratives on asylum seekers allude to them as Muslim invaders, with small boat crossings being characterized as an invasion of fighting-age men. Now, as we've been going through here, we're not insane conspiracy theorists. I'd like to think we're quite reasonable people that are just reading government documents and watching the videos and the people traffickers themselves. That is how the people traffickers themselves are identifying. How else am I meant to interpret videos of you breaking into a country, burning down a church, and snatching women off the street? If not, you think of yourself as an invading, conquering force. And you're gleeful about it. So the idea that we should tell ourselves that this isn't happening when those men are unapologetic about that and are actually showing videos to prospective clients saying this is what you can do is absurd and immoral. And I think this is only reaching new prominence now because we have ways of going around a very tightly controlled government narrative. We've got podcasts like yours, Louise, we've got outlets like Courage.Media, we've got GB News, and this is why the government are so keen after every terror attack, even if it had absolutely nothing to do with social media and alternative media, to rush straight to dealing with the second-order problem of we must clamp down on social media. This happened after Abi Harbi Ali, the son of a Somali diplomat, murdered Sir David Amess MP in his constituency surgery. You had colleagues and friends of Sir David Amess who had served alongside him for years, suggesting we needed David's law to crack down on online hate, as if their friend had been murdered by a tweet. And then now, in the aftermath of the Southport murders, you have Yvette Cooper and members of the Home Office, Yvette Cooper, who commissioned this report that said the grooming gangs do not exist, they're a far-right grievance narrative, saying that online harms are really the problem. It's that Axel Ruda-Cabana was radicalized to kill these girls because he saw a video of a stabbing of a bishop in Sydney in 2024, moments before he went and stabbed the girls. Never mind the fact that he had already brought a knife to school 10 times. Never mind the fact he'd been referred to Prevent 3 times while already having a youth justice referral order, so the government should have been monitoring him. Never mind the fact that, and this is very inconvenient for the government narrative and probably why they didn't monitor him, never mind that he was looking at numerous amounts of post-colonial, very anti-white literature, and that, according to school friends at the time, he had said, we need a white genocide and Britain needs a genocide like Rwanda. Now, these are very inconvenient motivations, as we've already discussed with the imported North African sex attackers. These are very inconvenient motivations to pin on a group which we're usually told is the source of our strength. So I wonder if the reason that the government have been gaslighting us on this, but also have been particularly recalcitrant to monitor acts of terror and sexual violence by migrants, the children of migrants and Muslims, is because it doesn't cast that multicultural narrative in a very good light. And this is what William Shawcross, when he reviewed Prevent, said. He said that Prevent were very unwilling to link Islam as an ideology to acts of terror, and instead were more interested in talking about these vague and nebulous family, mental health, and cultural issues. And they make up the preponderance of referrals. And he said that far-right terror referrals, which is obviously the more comfortable thing to talk about because that's predominantly committed by white men. Far-right, by the way, I should stress, means, according to Prevent and a list of texts they said are actively patriotic and proud, it means reading C.S. Lewis, Douglas Murray, The Lord of the Rings, and, without a hint of irony, 1984. So that's what puts you on a terror watch list. But they were 25% of referrals, and Islamic extremists were 20% of referrals, despite making up 80% of the open case files and far-right being only 10%. So we know that, like Abi Harbi Ali
and what about 95% of terrorist deaths in the last 30 years?
Yes, quite,
Yeah.
especially since the IRA bombings have stopped.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that Shawcross noted that. And then in the immediate aftermath, when members of the Home Office Islamic Network were sent on a counter-terror training course at King's College London in January 2024, they said that William Shawcross is the type to call any counter-terrorism people woke, so we shouldn't listen to him. How can we censor podcasts by Joe Rogan and Douglas Murray? And one civil servant actually said that Prevent is inherently racist, that's a quote, because it focuses on Islamic extremism. And moments later, when they played an ISIS training video, she pointed and laughed at the video and said, I know him, he went to my school. So those are the types of people that are currently running the anti-extremism body in government. Those are the types of people that are tasked with compiling the statistics on who's committing sexual violence and terror attacks against women and girls. So no wonder we're not getting that. And those are the types of people who are telling us, don't look back in anger anytime an imported terrorist commits an attack. So yeah, we are being gaslit.
I just remembered when I was at SOAS, Britain's most left-wing university, where I did my undergraduate degree, my thesis supervisor, who taught a course on British immigration, which I took. I long-standing. I obviously kind of read it against the grain, but I actually learned a lot from that course. She said that she had been asked by Prevent to take part in some research on how to include the mothers of men at risk of Islamic radicalization in like de-radicalizing their sons, and she refused to take part because she thought it was terrible that the government would expect basically mothers to snitch on their sons. I just recalled that. It doesn't necessarily reflect badly on Prevent, that story, but it does tell you something about academia and what people will say actually very openly within places like SOAS. I wanted to engage with one narrative that I've heard from friends on the left about the sexual violence issue, and I suppose a terrorist issue as well, because they take universalism as a very, very important moral prior. An argument that I have heard is violent men exist the world over. You know, maybe it's possible that there might be more violent men in some places because of some environmental influences, but they exist the world over. If a violent man comes to live in Britain from, say, Afghanistan, the kind of net amount of violence in the world remains stable, because if he weren't in Britain, he'd be in Afghanistan doing the same thing to women and girls there. So therefore, we shouldn't be overly concerned about this. Two objections to that. One, if you don't accept that universalist framing, if actually you think that the duty of the nation state is to protect the people who belong to the nation state, then obviously that falls flat. I mean, to some extent, this is like a fundamental distinction between the left and the right. And there are a lot of people on the left who actually just don't believe in the legitimacy of the nation state. They don't believe in the legitimacy of borders. You kind of can't, you just end up talking past each other. But I also thought that there's another point that's completely missed there, which is that actually, by virtue of British culture being in some ways, straightforwardly, admirably high trust and we're soft on crime, right? We don't have, for instance, a lot of protections around MPs. I mean, that's why David Amos and Joe Cox were so vulnerable to assassination, because politicians can expect to be safe. And there are loads of ways in which British culture, and this is true for other Western countries as well, is very has a really soft underbelly, because until quite recently we could have a soft underbelly and that was fine. Like, everyone accepted the rules and got on with it. There's this famous anecdote from the former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, where he goes to Leicester Square. No, I think it's Trafalgar Square. Anyway, a big square in the West End in London in the 1940s, I think, or just after the war, when he's there as a student, and he sees that there's an honesty box for people to get newspapers. So people just put their cash into an open container and take their newspaper, and no one steals the cash. And he's like, amazing. Like, isn't it remarkable that Britain is so civilized that it can do this? And then, of course, he sort of takes this learning back to Singapore. Those features of our culture actually generate violence, right? In the sense that when men from more violent cultures come here, in the sense that we are more vulnerable to, say, the assassinations of politicians or attacks on girls who are not constantly supervised by their male relatives, right? And also, I think because they regard us as being a soft touch, they think that we're ridiculous because we don't actually respond with, I mean, we certainly don't respond with like vigilante justice, right? But even our criminal justice system responds so weakly, right? That actually these crimes would not happen anywhere. They are precisely a product of this like culture clash and of the naivety, I'm sorry to say, of a lot of British people, and particularly within the British establishment. The one point I think where maybe we differ a little bit in our interpretation of this is that I still think that most of what's going on within the Home Office and within the establishment in general is idiocy, not malice.
I think it's idiocy and naivety on the part of British politicians who are liberal minded who think they can control this.
Mm-hmm.
So, a good example of this is that Michael Gove was overseeing a lot of Prevent during the previous Conservative government. He moved Prevent from the Home Secretary's jurisdiction to his Department of Levelling Up and Communities. And I've spoken to people familiar with Gove's thinking, and he thought he could play a role of mediator between the types of extremist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, who are now a proscribed jihadist group, who William Shawcross credits with externally lobbying the Home Office to soften its position on Islamist extremism, and the more moderate Muslims, for example, he would say the Khan sisters running Raiku, who could present the more respectable perspective on Islam and try to contain Islamist extremism. I think that is the naivety and competence. But I do think that if members of the civil service are laughing at the fact that they know jihadists, are they more likely or less likely to give quarter to the jihadist groups that are lobbying the Home Office in order to soften their perspective on Islamist extremism? So I do think there is in-group ethnic and religious preference at play that therefore allows actual Islamist terrorists like Abi Harbi Ali to evade detection, because otherwise, much like the perspectives of Muslim women who didn't want to report on their friends, brothers, fathers, cousins, etc., perpetrating the grooming gangs because it would make their family, clan, and religion look bad, I think the same holds for these Home Office civil servants who don't want their religion or ethnicity to look bad if they're responsible for the disproportionate amount of terror suspects, which they are. In regards to are we a soft touch in inviting these attacks, I would refer to a recent example where former Labour Minister Stephen Timms broke what is meant to be a cordon sanitaire with engaging with the Muslim Council of Britain, which was established, I think, in 2009 because their former deputy secretary signed the Istanbul Declaration, which was interpreted as allowing Muslim nations to fire on British warships if they were to intervene in a territorial dispute around Israel and Gaza. There was meant to be a ban on Whitehall engaging with them. He went to one of their gala dinners. Now, Stephen Timms in 2010 was stabbed by a jihadist who was inspired by Al-Qaeda recruiter Anwar al-Awlaki. So, of all people, he should know. But again, it seems that he's playing this sort of appeasing intermediary role, thinking that you can liaise with self-appointed representatives of the Muslim community who have a more sanitized and respectable face, despite them also being a pipeline for extremist groups. Because in their current election for their new Secretary General, one of the candidates is involved in the Muslim Vote Organization, which helped the four independent pro-Gaza MPs get elected at the last election. One of the people involved in the Muslim vote is a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, who again, a proscribed jihadist group. The other person who's running against him said that we need generation of Saladin after Saladin after Saladin to be raised in Britain in order to raise the level of Muslims in Britain who put their Muslim identity ahead of their British identity. So there's a very clear ethnic and religious in-group bias that's motivating their involvement in politics, whereas that's not the case for British people who think, I'm ethnically English and therefore I have to organise along ethnic English lines. We all organise along the lines of policy and of principle and of universal moral values. And this leaves us vulnerable to be exploited. And the final thing I will say about the idea that the relative levels of violence are being raised around the world, if left to our own devices, our level of crime would have continue to drop, especially if we were harsher on sex criminals, as we've mentioned, that trade in so-called non-violent child sexual exploitation material. There's always a victim there, as there is with pornography. If we were cracking down on things like that with harsher sentences, if we gave no quarter to the porn industry, if as well that you mentioned, I'm not advocating for vigilante justice, but whenever the fathers of the abused girls for the rape gangs would go and try and rescue their daughters, the police would arrest the fathers. So they did actually try. We voted against immigration. The fathers did try to physically intervene and defend their daughters, and they were punished by the state. If good men who were principled, like the Daniel Penny situation in New York, were allowed to intervene to protect women and were not persecuted by their state, who were interested in managing community cohesions and keeping good racial tensions, if that was allowed to happen, our crime rate would be much lower, because per capita, disproportionately, these imported men with backward values about women and girls are committing a large amount of sex crimes, murders, and terror attacks. And also, if we were not propping up those violent Islamist regimes around the world with foreign aid, for example, giving money to the Iranians or loads of foreign aid to Pakistan, despite them lowering the age of marriage to 9, if we weren't propping those regimes up, they might have a chance to change. And if we weren't establishing sort of ethnic and religious enclaves that were covering up the crimes of the rape gangs because they saw white girls as easy meat, then we wouldn't have this problem here, and we might have less of a problem around the world. So we're essentially doing everything wrong at the moment. So I don't accept those criticisms from people on the more left-wing universalist side of the fence.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.